August 1943, after the fall of Sicily to Allied forces. Operation Husky resulted in the capture of more than 130,000 Axis soldiers, mainly Italians, who were later transferred to prisoner of war camps in the United States. Many wounded soldiers were treated in U.S. military hospitals before being transported. His hands trembled as his fingers touched the clean bandage. Luigi Bianchi couldn't understand why the American nurse smiled while changing his dressings. He had left Sicily expecting to die in battle, or waste away in some dark basement as a prisoner. Instead, he found himself in a well-lit ward, where women in white uniforms tended to enemy soldiers with the same dedication they would give their own countrymen. This is the story of the Italian soldiers who, in hostile territory, discovered that war does not always harden all hearts. How could these men, raised to hate the enemy, comprehend such kindness from those they should despise? The weight of his body against the mattress felt strange, almost comforting. Luigi slowly opened his eyes, feeling the soft light filtering through curtains he didn't recognize. The strong smell of ether and medicines hung in the air, mingling with the scent of soap used to wash the sheets. His ribs still ached from the shrapnel that had hit him during the bombing in Catania, but the pain had lessened considerably. Turning his head to the side, he saw dozens of beds arranged in perfect rows, occupied by men in Italian uniforms like his. Some were sleeping deeply. Others were talking in low voices, and they all seemed to share the same bewildered expression that surely mirrored his own at that moment. A woman approached his bed, carrying a metal tray that clinked softly with every step. She wore a spotless white uniform and a small hat that framed her blonde hair, tied up in a bun. Luigi instinctively tried to hide under the sheets, expecting shouts or harsh words, but the woman only smiled and placed the tray on a small table beside the bed. "Good morning," she said in a gentle voice, and although Luigi didn't fully understand English, the affectionate tone was unmistakable. She began to examine his bandages with firm yet careful hands, removing the old ones with a delicacy that reminded him of his mother's hands when he was a child. The dirty fabric was replaced with fresh, clean gauze, and she applied a cream that immediately relieved the burning sensation. As the nurse worked, Luigi watched her focused face. There were small wrinkles around her blue eyes, suggesting she smiled often, and her hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed those actions hundreds of times. Occasionally, she murmured words that he didn't understand, but that sounded like encouragement. When she finished, she lightly touched his shoulder and pointed to the tray, indicating that he should eat. There was a plate of what looked like stew, fresh bread, and even a small bowl of fruit. The aroma of the food made his stomach growl loudly, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt hunger. During the past few weeks in Sicily, eating had been more of a desperate need than a pleasure. Luigi picked up the spoon with trembling hands and tasted the stew. The flavor was different from what he was used to, but it was warm and hearty, clearly made with fresh ingredients. As he ate, he observed the activity in the ward. Other nurses moved between the beds, all treating the Italian prisoners with the same professional kindness. A man in a white coat, probably a doctor, was speaking Italian with a soldier in the next bed, explaining his treatment in a strange mix of rudimentary Italian and expressive gestures. The entire scene seemed surreal, as if he had been transported to a parallel world where the rules of war didn't apply. How was it possible that these people, whose countrymen he had tried to kill just a few weeks earlier, were treating him with such humanity? The answer to his silent question came partially when the blonde nurse returned with a small piece of paper in her hand. She sat on the edge of the bed and, with patient gestures, showed that she had written a few words in Italian. "You are safe here." Luigi read the words several times, feeling something break inside his chest. It wasn't just physical relief from the pain or gratitude for the warm food, but a deep astonishment that left him speechless. He had spent months hearing about the cruelty of the Americans, about how the enemies would torture and humiliate any captured Italian soldier. Instead, he found competent medical care, abundant food, and an almost maternal patience. The nurse noticed his tears and offered him a clean handkerchief, saying something in English that, by the tone, could only mean that there was no shame in crying. Carlo Ferraro watched the ward with the eyes of someone who had seen too much in the trenches of North Africa. At 35 years old, he was the oldest among the Italian prisoners in that hospital ward, and his military experience told him that all this kindness was hiding some kind of trap. The scars on his left arm, the result of shrapnel from a grenade at El Alamein, hurt less since he arrived here, but his distrust remained intact. He had served under officers who used feigned kindness to extract information, and he knew that the Americans were masters of propaganda. The smell of disinfectant in the air reminded him of the German field hospitals, where medical efficiency often served less noble purposes than simply caring for the wounded. So when Nurse Margaret Collins approached his bed with a gentle smile, Carlo kept his face impassive and his muscles tense. Margaret had noticed the resistance from that prisoner from the first day. Unlike the others who seemed genuinely surprised and grateful for the care they received, Carlo watched her with calculating eyes, as though trying to decipher her true intentions. She recognized that kind of distrust, having seen it in other veteran soldiers who arrived at the hospital. With deliberately slow and visible movements, she began to examine his bandages, explaining each step in her basic Italian. "Questo non fa male," she said as she applied antiseptic. "Solo per pulire." Carlo remained rigid, but she noticed that he was watching every movement closely, as if searching for signs of cruelty disguised as care. The rough texture of the old bandages contrasted with the softness of the new dressing, but Carlo refused to show any relief from the treatment. During the bandage change, Margaret decided to try a different approach. She had learned a few words of Italian from other prisoners and knew that Carlo had asked about news from his family in Naples. With careful gestures, she pulled a sheet of paper from her uniform pocket and showed it to him. It was a form in Italian, translated by the hospital chaplain, which allowed prisoners to send a brief letter to their families informing them that they were alive and being well cared for. "Per la familia," she said, pointing to the paper. Carlo took the document with fingers that trembled slightly, but his face remained stern. He read each line several times, looking for some hidden catch or clause that might compromise him. The possibility of communicating with his wife and children was too tempting to ignore, but his military experience screamed warnings. The turning point came on the third day, when Carlo witnessed a scene that deeply disturbed his convictions. A young Italian soldier in the bed next to him had developed a severe infection and started to deliriously call out in high fever. Margaret and two other nurses worked through the night to lower his temperature, applying cold compresses, administering medication, and monitoring his vital signs. Carlo watched them take turns by the boy's bed, one even holding his hand while he cried out for his mother in delirium. When the fever finally broke at dawn, the three women were exhausted but smiling, clearly relieved to have saved the life of an enemy soldier. Carlo had seen German colleagues abandon wounded soldiers when they were no longer strategically useful. But here he was witnessing the opposite. People who were supposedly enemies fighting for the life of a soldier who, under normal circumstances, would be trying to kill them. Carlo's resistance began to crumble when Margaret returned the next morning, carrying not only his morning coffee, but also a translated response from the Red Cross. His letter had reached his family in Naples, and his wife had managed to send a reply. With trembling hands, he read the words from the woman he hadn't seen in 2 years, learned that his children were well, and that they were all praying for his return. Margaret watched the tears run down the weathered face of the tough man, and without saying a word, she placed a hot cup of coffee in his hands. The familiar aroma briefly transported him back home, to peaceful mornings in the kitchen with his family, before the war shattered everything. When he finally looked up to meet the nurse's gaze, Carlo saw something that completely disarmed him. There was no triumph in her eyes for breaking through his defenses, only a genuine compassion for a man suffering far from home. In that moment, he realized that he had misjudged not only that woman, but the entire concept he had formed about his captors. The sound of soft footsteps echoed through the ward corridor during the night shift change. Margaret Collins was finishing her notes on Carlo's medical chart when she heard voices in Italian from the other side of the ward. After 3 weeks of caring for these prisoners, she had learned to distinguish the tone of their conversations. When they discussed soccer, their voices would rise with passion. When they spoke of home, they became melancholic and nostalgic. But that night, there was something different, a reflective and restless quality that caught her attention. She approached discreetly and noticed that Luigi was trying to explain to the other soldiers why he had decided to write a letter of thanks for the treatment he had received. Non capisco perché, said a younger soldier. Sono nemici. Margaret didn't understand everything, but she grasped the essence of the discussion. Some prisoners were struggling to reconcile the kindness they received with the war narratives they had internalized. The smell of iodine used for disinfection mixed with the aroma of coffee that still lingered in the air from dinner. Luigi had become an informal leader among the younger Italian wounded. His initial experience of distrust transformed into gratitude, inspiring others to question their own perceptions of captivity. He told how Margaret had spent hours teaching him English words, how the American doctor had insisted on explaining each procedure before performing it, how the meals were served hot and in generous portions. Pensavo che ci avrebbero trattato come animali, he would say, gesturing as he spoke. Invece, ci trattano meglio di come I nostri ufficiali ci trattavano in Sicilia. His words caused thoughtful silences among the listeners, as everyone remembered the scarcity of food and medicine they had faced in the last months of the war. The rough texture of the uniforms they wore contrasted with the clean, soft sheets of the beds, a constant reminder that their situation as prisoners was, paradoxically, more comfortable than their life as active soldiers. The most dramatic transformation was occurring in Carlo, who had started to help Margaret translate conversations with other prisoners. His initial resistance had completely dissolved after receiving a second letter from his family, this time with a photo of his children that Margaret had managed to get through the Red Cross. He learned that Margaret had a brother serving in the Pacific and that she herself had lost her fiancé in Pearl Harbor, but that didn't stop her from caring for enemy soldiers with professional dedication. Come può essere così gentile con noi? He had asked through gestures and a mixture of Italian and English. Her answer, translated through a dictionary, had been simple but profound. Because you are someone's children. Too. That phrase spread among the prisoners like a benevolent virus, changing the way they saw their American nurses and doctors. The change in perspective wasn't just individual. It was collective. The Italian soldiers began to organize small gestures of gratitude. Some who could draw made portraits of the nurses to send to their families. Others taught Italian words in exchange for English lessons. There were even those who sang Neapolitan folk songs during the evenings, creating a strangely warm atmosphere in a prisoner of war ward. Margaret watched these transformations with a mix of professional satisfaction and personal surprise. When she had started working with prisoners of war, she had expected to find men hardened by fascism and hatred, but she discovered scared, wounded, and deeply nostalgic human beings. The war had shown her the worst of humanity, but this experience was revealing something unexpected about people on opposite sides, finding connection through simple acts of kindness. Captain Edward Harris, the doctor in charge of the ward, watched these changes with both clinical and personal interest. He had served in North Africa and seen Italian soldiers fighting fiercely alongside the Germans. But here in the hospital, he discovered that they weren't any different from American soldiers. Young men far from home, following orders, dreaming of the end of the war. During his medical rounds, he noted how the Italian prisoners actively cooperated with their treatments, asked intelligent questions about their conditions, and showed genuine concern for each other. Unlike some German prisoners he had treated, who maintained a disciplined coldness even when injured, the Italians expressed emotions openly and seemed genuinely grateful for the care. "Margaret," he said one afternoon while reviewing the charts, "I think these men are going to return to Italy with a very different perspective on the Americans." She agreed, knowing that this experience was building invisible bridges that could last long beyond the end of the war. The first snowfall of the American winter painted the landscape white beyond the ward windows, creating a scene none of the Italian soldiers had imagined seeing while prisoners of war. Luigi pressed his face against the cold glass, watching the snowflakes gently fall onto the hospital courtyard. The smell of hot chocolate came from the kitchen, specially made by the Irish cook who had become fond of the Italian prisoners and insisted on pampering them with little culinary luxuries. 3 months had passed since their arrival, and the ward had become something between a hospital and a strange international community. Margaret Collins approached with 2 steaming cups, offering one to Luigi with the warm smile he had learned to associate with safety and care. "Prima neve," she said, using one of the Italian phrases she had learned. Luigi smiled and replied, "First snow," in his hesitant but increasingly confident English. Carlo had been transferred to a recovery ward closer to the main hospital, but he still visited his fellow Italians daily. His transformation was the most notable. From a distrustful soldier, he had become a kind of cultural ambassador, helping to resolve misunderstandings and facilitate communication between prisoners and hospital staff. On that snowy morning, he was carrying a stack of translated letters, correspondence the soldiers had written to their families, describing the treatment they had received in the United States. Some were simple messages of gratitude. Others contained deeper reflections on the nature of war and humanity. "Mamma," wrote a young Sicilian soldier, "I nemici americani si sono presi cura di me meglio di quanto facessero i nostri stessi comandanti. Non so più cosa pensare della guerra." The texture of the American paper was different from what they were used to in Italy, thicker and whiter, but their words carried the emotional weight of discoveries that would change their lives forever. Margaret had developed a special routine for snowy days. She knew that the sight of the American winter made the Italians melancholic and nostalgic, so she organized small activities that kept their spirits high. She had convinced the chaplain to allow music sessions where the prisoners sang Italian folk songs, creating an atmosphere that mixed the exotic with the familiar. During these sessions, she observed how their voices naturally came together, creating harmonies that transcended the barriers of war. Luigi had become the unofficial musical leader, his clear tenor voice guiding the others through melodies that spoke of home, love, and longing. The nurses often paused their work to listen, some even trying to join in the melodies, even though they didn't understand the words. The sound of these songs transformed the clinical ward into something warmer and more human. The impact of this experience extended beyond the prisoners themselves. Margaret had begun writing letters to her family, describing her experience caring for the Italian soldiers, and her words revealed a fundamental shift in her own perspective on war and enmity. "Dear Mother," she had written the week before, "these Italian boys are not the monsters we were told to expect. They are frightened young men who miss their families terribly, just like our boys overseas. Taking care of them has taught me something about the difference between fighting a war and hating people." Her letters were shared among neighbors and friends, creating waves of reflection in her small hometown about the nature of conflict and the possibility of compassion even in times of war. Captain Harris had noticed similar changes across his medical team, who had developed a special efficiency and dedication when working with the Italian prisoners. The true measure of the transformation came when Luigi received news that he would be transferred to a regular prisoner of war camp inland. The prospect of leaving the ward filled him with an unexpected sadness. He had found there not only physical healing, but a kind of emotional redemption he hadn't known he needed. On his last night, Margaret appeared with a small gift, a Bible, in Italian that she had managed to get through the chaplain, with an inscription in English that Carlo had translated for him. "So you remember that kindness exists everywhere, even where we least expect to find it." Luigi held the book against his chest, feeling the physical and symbolic weight of the gesture. He knew that he would carry that lesson for the rest of his life, and that if he ever had children, he would tell them about the American nurses, who taught him that enemies can also be angels in disguise. The war would eventually end, but the memory of those months in the American ward would remain as proof that humanity can bloom even in the most unlikely soils of discord. The train that would take Luigi and other prisoners to the permanent camp sounded its long whistle at the station, a melancholy sound that echoed through the cold December air. Margaret had received special permission to accompany the group to the station, carrying a small bag with extra medicine and farewell letters written by the entire medical team. The smell of burned coal and steam mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee in her clothes from the last morning in the ward. Luigi held the Bible he had received tightly, but his eyes were fixed on the face of the nurse who had changed his understanding of enmity and compassion. Carlo, who would stay a few more weeks in the hospital due to complications in his recovery, had insisted on coming to say goodbye, supported by crutches that couldn't hide his determination to be present at this crucial moment. The rough texture of the wooden platform under their feet contrasted with the emotional softness of that final encounter, filled with mutual gratitude and genuine sadness. The farewell words were exchanged in a touching mix of Italian, English, and universal gestures of affection. Margaret had learned to say arrivederci and grazie with nearly perfect pronunciation, while Luigi managed to express his eternal gratitude in hesitant English. "You saved my life, not just body, but heart too." Other Italian soldiers approached to hug the nurse, some openly crying, others maintaining a stoic dignity that couldn't hide the emotion in their eyes. A young Sicilian named Giuseppe had spent the whole morning writing a poem in dialect about the American Madonna, who cared for him like a mother, and insisted on reciting it for Margaret before they left. She didn't understand all the words, but the melodic rhythm and emotional intensity of the performance made her cry, realizing she had touched lives in ways she could never have imagined when she started working with prisoners of war. The most touching moment came when Luigi pulled from his pocket a small wooden crucifix that he had carved during the long afternoons of recovery. It was a simple yet careful work, with delicate details that revealed hours of patient dedication. "For you," he said, placing the object in Margaret's hands. "So you remember Luigi Bianchi, always grateful." The wood still smelled faintly of oil used to finish it, and Margaret could feel the tiny marks of the pocket knife he had used to carve each line. She knew this gift represented much more than a simple craft. It was a tangible symbol of the transformation they had both experienced, the physical proof that genuine human connections can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. When she placed the crucifix on her personal chain, next to the cross that had belonged to her late fiancé, Luigi smiled with a deep satisfaction that transcended language barriers. Carlo watched the scene, supported by his crutches, reflecting on how those months had changed not only his perspective on Americans, but on the very nature of war and humanity. He had started writing a detailed diary about his experience in the ward, documenting not only the medical care he had received, but also the small everyday acts of kindness that had restored his faith in human goodness. "Quando tornerò in Italia," he had written the night before, "dirò a tutti che gli americani non sono I demoni che ci avevano descritto, sono persone che soffrono e amano proprio come noi." His notes included precise descriptions of Margaret and the other staff members, their ways of working, their expressions of genuine concern, their efforts to communicate in Italian. Carlo knew that this diary would become an important historical testimony, a counter-narrative to the war propaganda that painted enemies as inhuman monsters. When the train finally left, Luigi and the other prisoners waved from the windows until the station disappeared from view. Margaret remained on the platform long after the last car had vanished around the distant bend, holding the wooden crucifix and feeling the emotional weight of that chapter's end. Carlo approached and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, saying, in his improved English, "They will never forget you, Margaret. And you changed them forever." She knew he was right, but she also understood that the transformation had been mutual. Taking care of those Italian soldiers had taught her lessons about forgiveness, compassion, and the moral complexity of war that no medical training could have provided. When they finally returned to the hospital, the ward felt strangely empty and silent, but they both knew they carried within them the certainty that they had been part of something greater than routine medical care. "War may end someday," Margaret thought as she tucked the crucifix into her pocket, "but this experience will live forever in our hearts." The prisoner of war camp in Kansas stretched under an immense sky that vaguely reminded Luigi of the plains of Lombardy, But the similarity ended there. Luigi woke up on his first morning, observing endless rows of wooden barracks arranged with American military precision, vastly different from the welcoming ward where he had spent the last months. The smell of dry earth and fresh paint filled the air, mixed with the aromas of industrial cooking coming from the central mess hall. Other Italian prisoners, some directly from North Africa, others captured in Italy, moved about the camp with the resigned expression of men who had accepted their temporary fate. Luigi carried with him not only his few personal belongings, but also the lessons he had learned in the American ward, Margaret's Bible, the crucifix he had carved as a memento for himself, and most importantly, a transformed perspective on his captors that clearly set him apart from the other prisoners. The rough texture of the camp uniform contrasted with the soft sheets of the ward, but the memory of that comfort remained vivid in his mind. In the first days, Luigi discovered that his experience in the hospital was a near-unique anomaly among the prisoners. Most had been captured in battle and transferred directly to camps, without passing through civilian hospitals or having close contact with Americans in non-military situations. When he told them about Margaret and the care he received, some listened with skepticism, others with envy, and many with genuine curiosity about this humanized side of the enemy. Ti hanno fatto il lavaggio del cervello, said a Sardinian veteran. Gli americani sono furbi con la propaganda. But Luigi held on to his convictions, describing specific details that could not be invented. The way Margaret hummed softly while changing dressings, how Dr. Harris insisted on explaining each procedure, how the Irish cook prepared special dishes for homesick soldiers. Gradually, his stories began to plant seeds of doubt in the ideological certainties of other prisoners, sparking intense nighttime discussions about the nature of war and the humanity of the enemy. Luigi's influence spread subtly but persistently across the camp. He organized small conversation groups where he shared not only his medical experiences, but also the language lessons he had learned. He taught basic English phrases to other prisoners, always emphasizing the importance of courtesy and respect when dealing with American guards. Se li tratti come esseri umani, he explained, è più probabile che ti trattino allo stesso modo. His words found fertile ground, especially among the younger prisoners, who began adopting a less hostile and more cooperative attitude. The camp guards noticed these subtle changes: less tension during inspections, more cooperation in daily activities, an overall more positive atmosphere that made camp management easier. Luigi became informally a bridge between the two communities, translating not just words but also intentions and cultural misunderstandings that could have sparked conflicts. The true test of Luigi's transformation came when a group of German prisoners was transferred to the same camp. These soldiers maintained strict discipline and ideological loyalty, which contrasted sharply with the more relaxed and questioning attitude that had developed among the Italians. They tried to impose their military hierarchy and political convictions on the Italian prisoners, especially after Italy switched sides in the war in September 1943. Luigi found himself in a delicate position. Some Italians wanted to maintain solidarity with their former German allies, while others began to openly question the wisdom of their participation in the war. During a particularly tense discussion, Luigi told his full experience in the American ward, describing not only the medical care, but the discovery that people on opposite sides of a war could find common humanity. Ho visto il vero volto dell'America, he said, e non è quello che ci avevano raccontato. His words caused a prolonged silence, followed by thoughtful questions that revealed how deeply his experience had impacted how other prisoners viewed the conflict. The letters Luigi wrote home became involuntary historical documents, recording the evolution of his perspectives over the months at the camp. He described to his family in Tuscany not only the living conditions as a prisoner, but his reflections on the war, on America, and on Italy's future. Cara mamma, he wrote in a spring 1944 letter, ho imparato che la guerra è una cosa, e le persone che la combattono sono un'altra. Gli americani che mi hanno curato erano buoni cristiani, proprio come noi. Quando tornerò a casa, spero che potremo costruire una pace duratura con loro. These letters, preserved by his family, would later become part of a collection of prisoner correspondence studied by historians interested in the transformation of attitudes during prolonged conflicts. Luigi didn't know he was creating a documentary legacy. He was simply trying to communicate to his loved ones the magnitude of the inner change he had experienced. The war would eventually end, but the lessons learned in the American ward and deepened in the Kansas camp would remain the foundation of his worldview for the rest of his life. The Italy of 1945 that received Luigi back was a transformed country, devastated by war but brimming with possibilities for reconstruction. The port of Naples, where the repatriation ship docked on a sunny June morning, bore the scars of Allied bombings, but also the early signs of a nation determined to be reborn. The smell of the sea mixed with dust from rubble and fresh paint created an atmosphere of both endings and new beginnings. Luigi disembarked carrying a simple suitcase that contained not only his few belongings, but also priceless treasures: Margaret's Bible, photographs of the American ward he had received through the Red Cross, and, most importantly, a heart transformed by the experience of discovering humanity, where he had expected to find only enmity. The familiar texture of the Italian earth beneath his feet caused an intense emotion, but he knew he was no longer the same man who had left for Sicily 2 years before. His family was waiting for him at the small train station in Tuscany, but Luigi carried with him the responsibility of sharing lessons that went beyond his personal experience. The reunion with his family was a moment of joy, mixed with the complexity of communicating profound transformations. His mother, Caterina, immediately noticed the change in his eyes, a serene maturity that hadn't been there when he left as a young idealist. During the first weeks at home, Luigi gradually and carefully shared his experiences, knowing that his stories about American kindness might be met with skepticism in an Italy still processing the traumas of war. He showed the Bible in Italian that Margaret had given him, explained how he had learned English from American nurses, and described the medical care that had likely saved his life. His younger siblings listened in fascination, asking questions about America that revealed a genuine curiosity about the world beyond Italy's borders. "Are Americans really that different from us?" asked his brother Giuseppe. "No," Luigi replied. "They are exactly like us. They have families, they suffer, they hope for a better future. War has wounded them just as it has wounded us." Luigi found in Italy's reconstruction an opportunity to apply the lessons he had learned during captivity. He became involved with local organizations dedicated to helping veterans and refugees, bringing to this work the same compassionate, non-judgmental attitude he had experienced in the American ward. When former fascists returned to the communities, many facing ostracism and suspicion, Luigi was often a voice of moderation, arguing for the need for forgiveness and reconciliation. "If the Americans were able to treat me with kindness when I was their enemy," he said in community meetings, "we Italians can learn to forgive our fellow countrymen who have gone astray." His words carried the weight of lived experience, not just abstract ideals, and gradually gained influence in his region. The local parish priest, Don Antonio, noticed how Luigi had developed a unique pastoral perspective, able to see beyond political divisions to recognize the common humanity in everyone. The true measure of Luigi's impact came when he began teaching English to local youth who dreamed of emigrating to America. His lessons were different from traditional ones. In addition to grammar and vocabulary, he taught about American culture, values, and, most importantly, the importance of building bridges between different peoples. "English is not just a language," he explained to his students. "It's a key to understanding a people who can be our friends, not our enemies." Many of his students eventually emigrated to the United States and kept in touch with Luigi, reporting how his lessons had facilitated their integration into American society. Some even visited Margaret Collins, who continued working as a nurse in Chicago, creating a network of human connections that Luigi had never imagined when he wrote his first thank you letter from the Kansas camp. The war was over, but the relationships forged during the conflict continued to flourish and multiply. In 1950, 5 years after his return, Luigi received a letter that would once again change the course of his life. Margaret Collins was organizing a trip to Italy with other American veterans who had worked with prisoners of war, and she wished to meet some of the Italian soldiers she had known. The prospect of seeing the nurse who had transformed his understanding of enmity and compassion filled Luigi with profound joy. He spent weeks preparing for the meeting, practicing his English, organizing photographs of his new life, and reflecting on how to communicate to Margaret the lasting impact of her kindness. When they finally met at the Florence train station, both had aged and changed, but the emotional connection remained intact. "You kept your promise," Margaret said, looking at the confident and serene man Luigi had become. "You became a bridge between our peoples." They spent 3 days visiting Tuscany, sharing stories about their post-war lives and, most importantly, celebrating how a moment of medical care had transformed into a friendship that transcended borders and cultures. The seed planted in an American ward had grown into a tree of international understanding, whose fruits would continue to nourish future generations. "War taught us to hate," Luigi said in their final farewell. "But you taught me that it's always possible to choose to love." In every war hospital, enemy soldiers discover that humanity knows no borders when confronted with genuine suffering.